Hello and welcome to week 10 in the psychology of personality, and it's a big week. We're taking on two chapters and two major characters in the history of personality theory, and I'm a huge fan really of both of these individuals, and I just like talking about them. So we have Erik Erikson and Carl Jung, and both of whom were students and followers of Freud. In fact, Carl Jung was the individual that Freud had selected to carry on the torch of psychodynamic thinking, and the departure of Carl Jung and the departure of Erikson are the stuff of psychology history legend. The breakup of these relationships with people that Freud thought were ardent supporters of him. So we're going to start off with Erik Erikson, who probably is very often a familiar face, even to people who do not study psychology. And if you remember when we take a look at Freud, and we didn't really spend a lot of time looking at this particular aspect of it, but Freud can be considered the first developmental psychologist because he really did sort of develop this idea of how the id was present, the ego was in development, the superego developed as the person grew up and interfaced with the environment around them. So there was a developmental stage theory that he came up with called the psychosexual stages of development. And this is where we get the terms like, you know, the person oral phase and anal phase, and then, you know, those pieces there that came up from that, and the problems that came from fixation on that came from his developmental theory as a way to try and describe what he was seeing within his clinical practice. Now, Erikson felt that's all well and good, but he thought the interface between the developing psyche and the social expectations of the world was where all the action was happening, not what Freud referred to as the pleasure principle, which is the almost neurological pathway of development of greatest sensation that he felt was the driving force of human development. Erikson felt different. He felt that the social world and our efforts, I guess, to adapt to it or to counter it were where all the action was happening. So he looked at the psyche and he looked at the social world, and he coined the term that we use all the time now, psychosocial. So his psychosocial developmental theory is the one that he came up with in contrast to Freud's psychosexual theory. Now, as a fan, I have read a lot about Erikson, and my own work that I introduced a little bit in the Attention Getter really grew out of the basically stages 5 and 6 that fascinated me when I was early in my career, and right up to this day, I'm developing a piece of work that I call Puzzle Pieces that focuses on the establishment of self, identity, and personality based on intimate relationships. Now, identity, the hallmark stage of adolescence, and intimacy, the hallmark stage of young adulthood, one follows the other. And I look into that. Problems that can occur between stages 5 and 6 in human development that could lead to kind of put it into a little package about what Puzzle Pieces is looking at is what events in a person's life as they're transitioning through these two stages within Erikson's theory that produces the result where an individual defines themselves not as an independent agent interacting with the world, but define themselves mostly by who they're with. I'll leave the rest and the explanation of that to this book that I'm going to come out with someday, I promise. So back into the content here, we look at Erikson and his contribution to the field of psychology. And he introduced a stage theory, meaning that there are qualitative and quantitative differences between one stage and the other. There's an 8-stage theory, and we get introduced to that here with his stage theory, the first one being trust versus mistrust, then on to autonomy, then initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, and we see all those coming together, beginnings of the development and establishment of a sense of identity during adolescence, intimacy happening in young adulthood, generativity, basically your life work, happening in middle adulthood, integrity versus despair, happening in old age, and then there's despair versus gerund transcendence, which is not really original part of Erikson's theory. He sort of stopped with integrity versus despair. But nonetheless, those are his stages. And what they represent are similarities that exist between all people as they go through life and they encounter, this is kind of what stage theories are, is you're going through life and you're going to come to dilemmas. You're going to, like, say right off the bat, first year of life, does the world want you around? Is it going to meet your needs? Or does the world not want you around? It's not going to meet your needs. And we develop this basic sense of trust versus mistrust. It's closely aligned with the concept of attachment as to whether or not we feel that that we live in a world that cares that we exist. Now, I want to caution you that because I study and read and write about the world of intimate relationships, that the trust issues that arise from being burned or having bad partners or spousal abuse or any sort of abuse that happens are different than this fundamental trust versus mistrust. They're still vital. I mean, I'm not downplaying that, but it is different than this, first year of life not being accepted in the world. There's a book by a person named Pilzer, I think that's his name, A Child Called It, and it's a story of a child who is born into a family that does not even really validate that they exist. And I would venture to guess that despite the fact that Dave grew up to be a functioning human being, he did have issues with basic trust and mistrust. Later in life, as we get older, the terrible twos come in, and kids want to be autonomous, and how are we going to handle that? And then in the threes, which oftentimes people will say are even worse than the twos, depending on how you deal with this, is kids come up with initiatives. It's the 2-year-old wants to do things on their own. The 3-year-old's going to get the idea to make you breakfast while you're in bed. And so they take on that initiative. And then when they enter into school, they encounter comparison. And so how good they are at something becomes an aspect of their developing identities. Now, all of that sort of leads, depending positive or negative, balances, there are continuums between each one of these. It's not either or. It leads them into the first sort of like adult-like internalization representation schema, let's say, of themselves, of who they are. And in adolescence, we start to see the development of a true identity. And we can almost sometimes parallel that with personality, and that's why it's in the course. And so you have this individual who they are, and then they enter into adolescence, and if we look at cognitive development, and they have the ability to think more abstractly at this point in adolescence, they can think, well, what if I want to be something different than I've been all this time? And that's when you see the experimentation and the openness to experience and all that stuff that can happen during that age, and all part of a natural process of developing the self. Now, once that is adequately developed, hopefully, and that's the whole context of my book, is that maybe we should know ourselves before we join with another, just like Erikson was right, in identity, then intimacy. Then knowing who we are, we find people in our lives to connect with. Now, we've been connecting with people all along. That's fine, but there's something different about these relationships that then occur as young adults. And then after that, Erickson identified that we enter into the longest phase of our lives, which is the generative age, which is where we're doing our stuff. We're contributing to the world. We have our work, we have our house, we have the art, we have our books, we have our, it's the legacy that we will leave when we get to the other end. After all that is, we enter into old age, and maybe we change role. Remember, this is psychosocial, so in the social world, when we retire, we might not be done or even close to done, but we do enter into a period of time of one phase of our life is over, and there's a reflective component to that. And when in late life, particularly in very late life, individuals will spend a lot of time reviewing their lives. If you were going to interview somebody, as students do in my developmental psychology class, my students have to interview someone age 65 years or older and get their life story. That's pretty easy to do because most people 65 years old or older are engaged in this reflection process. It's a natural occurring process. And they're reviewing their life, and if they do see a consistent sense of self throughout that time without a whole lot of regret, then they have a sense of integrity. If not, it's too late to make those changes, and some people may end up in despair. You can see the importance of all these stages as they occur across the lifespan. Now, the different components that we can talk about that, there's barriers. Once somebody goes, if right at the beginning somebody's on the mistrust level, that's pretty serious, and every negative notch makes it more likely that they're going to go negative. Every positive makes it more likely that they're going to go positive in general. Now the caveat to that, of course, is resilience. Resilience is the individual that, they get knocked over, but they don't seem to stay on the negative side. And that's still a mystery to psychologists. So while we have this tendency that negative social interactions with our developing identity will tend to move us in that negative way, we have these people that go through hell, and they still seem to come out on the positive end, and they have a different quality that we call resilience, which we're still trying to figure out. Now, in adulthood, we recognize that individuals will have difficult decisions to make as they're aging. And in that context, and certainly a very important part of my puzzle pieces model, is I introduced James Marcia's theory of identity status. Now, James Marcia is a Canadian psychologist who, like me, a Canadian psychologist, who really likes Erickson. And he developed an idea about when we're creating aspects of ourselves, and it's very constructionist as well. When we create aspects of our identity, that we engage in two fundamental processes. One that he calls crisis, and one that he calls commitment. And if you put that on a 2x2 graph, you can see that there's 4 statuses in which any aspect of our identity could be. So it could, and depending on whether or not a crisis has happened or whether or not a commitment has happened. Now, it's all about choices. So when we look at the word crisis, we have to make sure that we're clear that in this particular context, in the context of Marcia's theory, crisis refers to I have to make a choice and I'm looking. So you're buying a new car, you don't know if you're going to get the Mercedes or the Tesla. Don't we all wish that was the choice, right? You're going to get a Mercedes or a Tesla. You're not quite sure. You're currently in a Marcia crisis in terms of your car identity. And so it's not that you need an Ativan, it's that you're in the process of deciding. So whether or not you've gone through that process or not determines your status. And then the commitment. And so he referred to, if you have gone through the process of making a selection, you've looked at the options and you've committed to one, you've picked one, he calls that identity achievement. That's the goal, is identity achievement. Now, if you picked, but you never really looked at the options, he calls that foreclosure. And you can kind of see where that comes. Your identity's been foreclosed, like your loan's been foreclosed. It's an early, chopping off of options. And individuals who, let's say, they become pregnant unexpectedly very early in life may experience their first motherhood as a foreclosed identity. It came upon them, kind of thing. Then if in fact, however, you are actively looking at the options, let's say you're dating, but you're not committed to one person, you're just meeting people, and stuff like that, we would call that identity moratorium in terms of your relationship identity. And that means I'm shopping. And the last one is, it's on the back burner. I'm not looking, not committing. Let's say for many of you are probably not thinking about your retirement home, where you want to live. Maybe there's a plan, but you're not like actively shopping, for it. So that's basically what we call diffusion. So if we picture the identity as a bunch of structures that we put together, we get the notion of why I call my theory puzzle pieces, which are the identities like a jigsaw puzzle, and all the pieces come together to form a picture of you, your identity, your personality. Some of those pieces were cut for you. You were born with them. Others you cut yourself. Some of them, you're cutting them. You got them, but then you're going to change them. And so we have a jigsaw and we have pieces and we're putting all these together. But you can look at any one of those pieces and you can say, where is that? Where is that today? And it fits into one of these, and then they can change over time. So it gives us almost like a way to diagnose, let's say, the status of your identity. Because we look at all these pieces of your identity, who you are, like so your career identity, your job, like you're in college preparing, so you probably looked at different colleges, and if you did and you looked at college and you picked UMA, you're in terms of your status as a UMA student, hopefully you feel pretty good about it. It's an achieved status. You looked at the options, picked the one that you thought was the best. Let's say right now you're looking to transfer. So you're looking around, you don't want to be a UMA student anymore, and you're looking around at different colleges. You're in terms of your student status, you're in moratorium. Let's say, however, you have a relative that works for UMA, and let's say your parents said, you're going to UMA because it's free, because I work there, you can't go anywhere else, then maybe your status is foreclosed. Hopefully none of you are in diffusion, because that would be, it'd be hard to get work done. But we can look at any piece of our identity, and this is a unique way of looking at identity as a collection of pieces that we construct to form the ultimate picture that we review during integrity. Back to Erickson here, when we get to integrity, we go through all these stages, and then at the end of the day, the end of life, we're looking at these, late in life, we're looking at the whole puzzle, and like, how did I do? So, cool models here. Now, when we look at concepts in our lives like midlife crisis, let's use Marcia's term there. It's not it could be pretty dramatic. You reach 50, you have a recognition that you're aging, you feel like you've been foreclosed in a lot of areas, so you go through a divorce, get a sports car, date a girl named Buffy. Nothing about people named Buffy. But that kind of departure, that radical departure is actually very rare. Most people arrive at midlife, and there's a midlife event where they recognize there's now more days behind them than there is, sort of halfway, even though what we define as the midpoint is actually a little bit more further along the way. But they're looking and saying, am I on the right path? Because if I'm going to make a change, I'm going to make it now. Now, KV where I work full-time, and UMA are midlife meccas. This is where people go when the kids are left, you know, changes are happening, a little bit more stable financially, time to work on me. That's a midlife crisis. It's not the kind of midlife crisis that we see in the movies, but certainly it's the kind of midlife crisis that we can experience. So, okay, so that leads us into our discussion, which focuses on James Marcia's theory and the quiz, which has you look at Erikson's stages and kind of like tell me where you are and how things are going. So a little bit of, what led you to that place. Maybe you're a young adult. You have a good sense of who you are, although you're in college, still developing significant parts of that. But you're in a relationship, not sure if it's the one for forever, kind of thing. That's your status. You're probably in moratorium in some of these ways. And so kind of a revealing of that. Now, as we transition to the next theorist here, we really move into an area that sort of defines itself within the field of psychology, and that's depth psychology or transpersonal psychology. And for some people, this is a little off the charts, and for other individuals, this really resonates because there's a deep spiritual, deep metaphysical component to the work of Carl Jung and his contributions. So one of those major contributions was he built upon Freud's idea that the motivations of the unconscious reveal themselves in dreams. Now, Freud would sit down with people and he would talk about the dreams and he would interpret them in light of potential id and superego conflicts. Where Carl Jung went is, I kind of want you to picture, there's an image in the course book here where we see the personality, this iceberg sitting in the water, which is kind of a typical way in which Freud's theory is presented, where the surface of the water represents the consciousness level. Everything above we're aware of, and everything below we're unaware of. And so this iceberg is sitting there. The iceberg is the personality, and most of it, just like a real iceberg, is underwater, and you can't see it. There's just a little tip that's sticking out. And that tip is the ego. That's pretty much what we're aware of. And that through the process of psychoanalysis and dream interpretation and all the things that Freud used to do, he would highlight what might be going on underneath the water that explains our lived experience of emotions and conflicts and whatnot. Carl Jung came along and he said, I think these dreams are important, but he kind of focuses attention, and this is my way of thinking of it, he kind of focuses attention on the water. What's in the water? So you think about an iceberg sitting in the water, and there's the liquid there, but then there's all kinds of animals and sea monsters and polar bears and all that stuff. And he saw that we all may, in a metaphysical way, our personalities may be all resting in the same spiritual ocean that he called the collective unconscious. So he refers to that entire ocean in which all these icebergs, all you and I, are floating. And that just like, let's say, whales underwater can communicate around the globe because of the way they talk to each other, that we can actually do the same thing. We are influenced by shared experiences below our consciousness, but we can also communicate with others unconsciously. We're not aware of this, and neither are they. That's the kind of the Jungian way. And the way that manifests is that in Carl Jung's work, he focused a lot on symbolism. That when people were dreaming, he thought that what was happening is the symbolic representations or the archetypes and the energies that exist within the ocean transfer into the personality and represent themselves in consistent symbols. And those symbols are the circle or the mandala or the cross for humanity, all of these different things. And he studied these on a global basis and formulated essentially the first dictionary of dream symbolism. Now, so his way of looking at dreams were, what do your dreams mean, not literally, but what do they mean symbolically? Where this source of wisdom, he really thought that the ocean was a source, this collective unconscious was a source of wisdom. And what's it teaching you? And he thought that maybe if we interpret these dreams symbolically, it can move us forward in what lessons is our spiritual selves trying to teach us. So we have this symbolic interpretation of dreams that comes along, which exists to this day. And as I discuss in my attention getter here, is I do that. I like to practice symbolic interpretation. Not so much to say that's what the spirits are telling you or that's the message from God, but boy, is it ever a good conversation starter to throw some of that symbolism in there, and then we can move on to rich discussions about what might be going on. Had some fairly good success with that. Now, the other component, I talked about being shared symbolism and then sharing all the beings that exist within that collective ocean, but there's also the communication that occurs, and that's what Carl Jung referred to as synchronicity. And that is, he felt that there was no such thing as chance, that we encounter people because our souls, or the part of our personalities that are in this collective unconscious, arranged to have that happen. And so we only exist, we see it as, just happenstance, but chance. I just ran into this person and I found the perfect job. But what we get from this, maybe in the common vernacular, is we refer to soulmates. That there's someone out there, and we're communicating with each other at that unconscious level. And all of that stuff really arose from Carl Jung's work with the collective unconscious. And so there's all kinds of things I put into the course book about that, and your textbook's full of stuff as well. Now that brings us to certainly one of our assignments, and an interesting personality test, probably the most popular personality test, except for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And I say that because it's almost my favorite word to say, my favorite phrase. But the Myers-Briggs Type Inventory was a personality test that results in giving you one or more of 16 personality types. Now, this is different than traits. These are types or collections of traits, whereas traits are sort of like you have different levels of those traits. Types is like, there's a certain, and probably the most common one we know of is probably our horoscope. You're an Aquarius, or you're a Virgo, or an Aries, and it's a collection of personality traits that goes along with that. Now, these are based, the ones in the Myers-Briggs, even though it's a paper pencil test, they actually have its origins in Carl Jung's theory of personality. So worthy of looking into for all of the good that comes from that, that what actually came. Now with that, with all of what I've said, and we had this idea of encounters in the world not being by chance, I introduced you to the idea of happenstance. Now, happenstance is a word I used a while ago to talk about its equivalent to chance, but there's actually a model, and it exists within career development, and it could be in life development, of planned happenstance, which is essentially leading a life that enables you to be ready for opportunity when opportunity knocks. And in the career development world, that came about because research on people who are in successful careers revealed a high degree or high incidence of a particular experience. And that was, they would interview people who have careers that they love, and they said things like this: I never knew I would be in this position, and here I am loving it. Now, this runs very counter to the traditional career development perspective that we have of we look at what we're good at, we look at what we like to do, and we pick careers that have those things, and we go training, and then we enter those careers, and then, off we go. That in fact, as I'm speaking of the choir here, many of you probably know deeply that that is simply not the way it works. And even though you've come into college with a career plan because you have a degree, you're looking to a degree, what you end up actually doing with that may be much more the product of chance encounters that you would have never anticipated. However, we can place ourselves in, even if we're following a plan, we can place ourselves in the ability to be able to accommodate opportunities like that. We're lighter on our feet. We're able to experience change. We're able to change our directions. We're able to do those kinds of things. That we have savings in order to tide us over for periods of unemployment because we're transitioning and we're moving where the wind moves responsibly, in a planned way, moving in a direction, but being open to the notion that I may not know the destination yet, but I'm certainly traveling along the path. And that is in the career development world, it's catching on as something, not that we need to just embrace, but that it's actually happening a lot. That's actually how people come across that dream job. So if you're getting all anxious about that dream job, maybe the idea is to create a lifestyle and an openness to experience that will allow you to successfully evaluate opportunities and take opportunities as they come. Or place yourself in the position of having those opportunities. You certainly can't sit at home and wait for an opportunity to knock on the door. But if you're networking and you're going to conferences and you're doing things, getting involved, you have lots of diversity, then who knows if you took up kayaking and then you went kayaking and then you're out for a couple beers with somebody and one of your kayak buddies turns to you and says, hey, I got an opening in my company and it's your dream job. But it was because you were open to going kayaking. That kind of thing is actually gaining traction. So we head into the assessments for this particular chapter. We have two discussions. One is about Carl Jung's recognition that we strive to achieve balance. Then there's one about planned happenstance and where you're at with that, what I just got done talking about. And then we move into the assignment where I give you a couple of options. One's an app, one's a website, to actually take a version of the Myers-Briggs type inventory and report out on that and do some reflection on what did it teach you. It's actually, interestingly enough, not one of the top rated psychometric instruments that's out there. It's fun and it's used by a lot of people and it gives you really good information, but it doesn't really meet the reliability, authenticity kind of test that we have, unlike the 16PF and other tests. Nonetheless, people use it all the time as a personal growth. They use it, they feel it's very valid, they feel it's very much describes them, want you to experience that. And every time I've encountered the MBTI, it was with instructions that said, picture yourself as the part of yourself that's at work, or the part of yourself that's at home or with family or friends and stuff like that, to get an accurate. Because oftentimes we do have different aspects of ourselves that would respond to some of the questions on the MBTI differently based on our social role. So that's what kind of invalidates it as a personality test, but it also opens it up for much greater application. I've had couples take this and develop incredibly rich conversations about how to deal with each other based on different personality traits, and the amount of resources, free resources that are available. Put MBTI into your Google search, and you'll literally get millions of hits. Resources, books, guides, on interpreting all kinds of secondary analyses to, determine how to communicate better. I mean, valid or not, it's useful. And so use this at your pleasure. Give it to all of your kids, bring it to your workplace, make sure your spouse, partner, girlfriend, boyfriend takes this and you have a nice conversation about it. There's no such thing as a bad personality type, but there's certainly understanding where people are coming from the point of view of this test is a really, really fun thing to talk about. So this is a busy but fun week. So I look forward to hearing more about this in the discussion boards, and I will see you then.